The heavy winter silence within the historic limestone estate in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, was absolute and suffocating. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows of the grand living room, a dense January snowfall blanketed the cobblestone streets, muffling the distant sounds of the city and creating an atmosphere that felt deeply mournful. Matthew Knight sat motionless in his customized, state-of-the-art electric wheelchair, his hollow gaze fixed entirely on the gray, unforgiving sky above the Charles River. 3 long years had passed since that catastrophic night when a head-on collision caused by an intoxicated driver shattered his spine, instantly stripping away his physical freedom, his fierce corporate drive, and his basic desire to live. The multi-billion-dollar real estate development empire he had built from nothing, a corporate titan valued at over $3 billion, continued to expand flawlessly under his board of directors. But Matthew himself had become a mere shadow haunting empty rooms. Medical experts from prestigious institutions across New England spoke endlessly about rigorous physical therapy, innovative technological adaptations, and psychological resilience. But Matthew had completely stopped listening after the first 12 months of agonizing failure. What was the ultimate purpose of fighting for partial mobility when the fundamental essence of his vibrant, fiercely independent life had been permanently erased from existence? His immense wealth could not purchase the simple ability to walk through a public park, and his immense corporate power could not bring back a genuine smile to his face, leaving him with everything and absolutely nothing simultaneously. On this particular freezing afternoon, Matthew returned from a routine medical evaluation much earlier than his staff anticipated because the primary physician had attempted to discuss an expensive, experimental neurological treatment. Matthew had coldly interrupted the doctor mid-sentence, instructing his personal assistant to immediately wheel him back to his transport vehicle, utterly refusing to entertain more false promises and subsequent emotional devastation. Maneuvering his electric wheelchair into the primary first-floor master suite, Matthew suddenly halted as an unexpected sight shattered the familiar, pristine order of his private sanctuary. A young woman, the newly hired evening cleaner from the domestic agency, was sitting completely motionless on a wooden chair positioned directly beside his massive bed. Her head rested heavily against the edge of the mattress, and her right hand hung loosely toward the hardwood floor, still clutching a bright yellow microfiber dusting cloth. She was fast asleep, her quiet, rhythmic breathing breaking the absolute silence of the room that Matthew usually guarded with fierce, intimidating hostility. Matthew felt an immediate wave of intense irritation wash over him as he stared at the sleeping intruder, wondering how many staff members he would have to cycle through this month. She was already the 4th cleaner the domestic agency had sent in the past few weeks, as no worker could endure his freezing demeanor and harsh, silent treatment for more than a few days. Before Matthew could harshly awaken the young woman and demand her immediate departure from his estate, his sharp gaze fell upon a small object, lying open on the floorboards right beside her limp hand. He carefully maneuvered his wheelchair a few inches closer, his curiosity piqued by the unmistakable appearance of a worn, heavily annotated literary book, rather than a cheap romance novel or a smartphone screen. It was a vintage collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson, its pages yellowed with time, corners deeply creased, and margins filled with meticulous pencil notes that indicated someone had returned to these verses repeatedly. The sleeping cleaner stirred slightly, murmuring an unintelligible phrase under her breath before settling back into her deep, exhaustion-induced slumber. Matthew found himself staring intently at her face, realizing she was quite young, perhaps 24 years old, with dark hair tied into a chaotic, hurried bun that seemed to mirror a life lived in constant motion. The pale winter light revealed prominent dark circles under her eyes, clear physical evidence of chronic sleep deprivation, while her clothes were simple, clean, but distinctly faded from countless cycles through a laundromat. Her hands, resting quietly near the poetry book, were visibly rough and chapped, showing the unmistakable signs of early damage caused by harsh industrial cleaning detergents. For the first time in 3 agonizing years, Matthew felt a tiny spark of genuine curiosity pierce through his thick armor of total emotional numbness and bitter indifference. He slowly reached down from his wheelchair armrest, carefully picking up the open poetry book, while ensuring he did not make a single sound that might prematurely disturb the sleeping woman. His eyes fell upon a specific stanza that had been deeply underlined in dark graphite, the words echoing with a strange, haunting relevance that seemed to mock his own inner darkness. The verse spoke of hope being the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, singing a tune without words and never stopping at all, a concept that Matthew found bitterly ironic given his own absolute despair. He would have smiled mockingly at the sentimentality of the poem if he could still remember how to form a smile, but instead, he carefully placed the volume back onto the floorboards, exactly where it had previously lain. At that precise moment, the young woman's eyelids fluttered open, and she stared directly at him for a second, with complete disorientation, as if unable to comprehend her immediate surroundings. Then, realizing she was sitting in the private bedroom of the notoriously volatile billionaire employer, she lunged upward so violently that the wooden chair wobbled precariously against the nightstand. Her face flushed crimson, and her voice was raspy with panic as she desperately apologized, stating she never intended to neglect her duties. Matthew continued to stare at her, with an entirely unreadable, expressionless face, his voice cutting through her frantic apologies with a dry, raspy edge born from days of complete silence. He asked her what her name was, his tone devoid of warmth but lacking the explosive anger she clearly anticipated from the warning stories circulating at the domestic agency. The young woman blinked in visible surprise at the calm question, swallowing hard before introducing herself as Natalie Zeller, her hands tightly wringing the yellow dust rag as if seeking physical stability. Matthew demanded to know exactly why she was sleeping on the job, his eyes narrowing slightly as he waited for a fabricated excuse or a defensive lie. Natalie took a deep breath, explaining honestly that she was currently working 3 separate jobs simultaneously in order to independently finance her evening classes at a local university. She admitted that she had spent the previous night cleaning a massive corporate office building downtown until 4 o'clock in the morning, leaving her with no time to rest before traveling to his estate. She confessed that she had only intended to close her eyes for a single minute while dusting the bedpost, pleading with him to believe that such an unprofessional mistake would never happen again. Matthew remained entirely silent for what felt like an eternity, knowing that standard household protocol dictated he terminate her employment immediately for such a flagrant violation of professional boundaries. Yet, instead of uttering the words that would dismiss her, he found himself asking what specific subject she was choosing to study during those late-evening university classes. Natalie looked down at her worn shoes, answering quietly that she was pursuing a degree in English literature, a confession that made her cheeks burn with a slight hint of vulnerability. Matthew's gaze drifted back to the worn poetry book resting on the floorboards, asking if Emily Dickinson was a mandatory part of her curriculum or a personal choice. Natalie looked up, her eyes shining with a sudden, unexpected spark of passion, as she explained that this specific volume was her absolute favorite treasure, one she carried everywhere for personal comfort. For the first time since the devastating accident, Matthew Knight felt something resembling genuine human interest stir within his frozen chest, displacing his perpetual bitterness. He instructed her to return to her cleaning duties, turning his electric wheelchair toward the bedroom door while telling her to ensure she slept in her own bed the following night. Natalie stood entirely frozen in place, unable to comprehend why she still possessed her job, while Matthew realized he was already anticipating her return. Throughout the following 48 hours, Matthew caught himself doing something completely absurd. He was actively counting the hours until Tuesday morning, the specific day Natalie was scheduled to return. It was an entirely pathological realization for a reclusive billionaire to find himself waiting for a young cleaner with the anxious anticipation of a teenager preparing for a first romantic encounter. On Tuesday morning, he awakened significantly earlier than usual. refusing his standard morning routine of staring blankly at the wall of his master bedroom. Instead, he explicitly instructed Peter, his fiercely loyal personal driver and executive assistant, to position his electric wheelchair in the grand library, the exact room Natalie always cleaned first. Matthew placed a digital tablet on his lap, pretending to analyze complex corporate financial reports, but his ears were entirely tuned to the distant sound of the heavy front entrance doors opening. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the faint sound of light, hurried footsteps echoed across the pristine marble floors of the grand hallway, signaling her arrival. Natalie stepped cautiously into the massive, book-lined library, holding a plastic bucket filled with various cleaning solutions, freezing instantly when she noticed Matthew sitting quietly in the center of the room. She offered a quiet, polite morning greeting, immediately casting her eyes downward toward the polished floorboards, to avoid direct eye contact with her intimidating employer. Matthew did not offer a pleasantry. Instead, he extended his arm and firmly commanded her to sit down in the plush leather armchair positioned directly opposite his wheelchair. Natalie hesitated, gesturing toward her cleaning supplies and mentioning her schedule, but Matthew repeated his command with an iron authority that left absolutely no room for further domestic refusal. She sat down nervously on the absolute edge of the expensive leather seat, keeping her hands clasped tightly over her knees, like a defendant preparing to receive a severe legal judgment. Matthew set his digital tablet aside, listing the specific facts of her life, like a seasoned prosecutor conducting a formal courtroom deposition regarding evening classes and multiple jobs. He demanded to know why a student with her obvious intellectual dedication was not enrolled in a standard, full-time day program supported by an academic scholarship. Natalie swallowed hard, explaining that she had actually been awarded a comprehensive scholarship during her freshman year, but her personal family circumstances had changed drastically. The sudden shift forced her to immediately seek full-time employment, making it completely impossible to maintain a traditional daytime academic schedule, which necessitated her transition to evening classes. When Matthew quietly pressed her to explain the exact nature of those changing circumstances, a visible shadow of profound sorrow passed over Natalie's expressive features. She whispered that the matter was deeply personal, her voice trembling slightly as she drew a clear line regarding her privacy, a boundary that Matthew surprisingly respected with a long, understanding silence. He shifted the conversation toward her exhausting work schedule, asking for a detailed account of the 3 separate jobs she claimed to be juggling every week. Natalie explained that she cleaned his Beacon Hill estate 3 times a week, worked the late-night janitorial shift at a commercial tower on Tremont Street on Thursdays and Fridays, and spent her weekends waitressing at a busy cafe in the North End. Matthew calculated the hours in his head, demanding to know exactly when she found the time to sleep like a normal human being. Natalie offered a small, weary shrug, stating that she managed to get 4 or 5 hours of sleep whenever her chaotic schedule permitted, claiming it was entirely sufficient for her needs. Matthew countered dryly that it was clearly insufficient, which was the precise reason she had collapsed into a deep sleep beside his bed the previous week. A deep, embarrassed crimson rushed back into her cheeks as she apologized once more, labeling her past behavior as utterly unprofessional and unacceptable. Matthew interrupted her sharply, stating that her constant apologies were becoming incredibly grating and that he had not brought her into the library to extract further expressions of guilt. An awkward, heavy silence settled between them, with Natalie nervously adjusting the sleeve of her faded work uniform while Matthew studied her resilient posture with intense scrutiny. With a sudden burst of quiet courage, Natalie looked up and asked Matthew why he had chosen not to terminate her employment after her blatant mistake. She noted that the domestic agency had explicitly warned her that he was an impossibly demanding client who had dismissed previous cleaners for minor infractions. Matthew stared at her for a long moment, pondering the question himself, before offering an answer that was completely devoid of his usual corporate calculation. He revealed that every previous cleaner sent to the estate would invariably look at his wheelchair and begin to weep with overwhelming pity, or pretend the chair did not exist at all. Natalie, however, had simply fallen asleep in his presence, treating him as though he were an entirely ordinary, normal human being, rather than a tragic medical spectacle. Natalie nodded slowly, her voice incredibly soft yet filled with an absolute, unwavering conviction, as she stated that he was normal, merely paralyzed, and that the two concepts were entirely different. Something buried deep within Matthew's chest shifted violently at her words, a small, forgotten ember of human dignity flaring to life after years of dark emotional frost. He abruptly changed the subject, inquiring about her ultimate career aspirations once she finally completed her lengthy English literature degree. Natalie's face illuminated with a brilliant, genuine warmth as she confessed her dream of working as a professional book editor, helping authors shape stories of human resilience. She whispered that she hoped to one day write her own book about ordinary people who absolutely refuse to surrender, even when their entire world collapses into ruin. Matthew felt a sharp, bitter pang of irony strike his mind, recognizing that he was the absolute embodiment of total surrender and passive capitulation to tragedy. He coldly instructed her to return to her domestic duties, claiming she was wasting valuable working time by engaging in idle conversation in his library. Natalie rose from the armchair immediately, but before she crossed the threshold of the room, she turned back and softly thanked him for granting her a second chance. Left entirely alone in the massive library, Matthew sat completely motionless for hours, staring out at the falling snow while contemplating the concept of a second chance. He wondered if a bitter, broken man like himself could ever truly deserve such a gift, or if Natalie was the unexpected catalyst sent to deliver it. The subsequent weeks introduced a transformation to the sprawling estate that was so incredibly subtle, Matthew almost failed to recognize its gradual progression. Natalie arrived faithfully every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and with each visit, a distinct sense of warmth began to permeate the cold, sterile rooms of the historic mansion. The most immediate physical alteration Matthew noticed involved the numerous large houseplants arranged across the expansive, sunless corners of the formal living room. These exotic green plants had been sent as hollow corporate sympathy gifts by his business associates immediately following his accident, left to wither slowly in the deep shadows. On a bright Thursday morning, Matthew discovered that Natalie had completely rearranged the heavy pots, placing each one directly beneath a window or a warm reading lamp. When he demanded to know why she had dared to alter the established placement of his property, she did not flinch or offer a submissive apology to his harsh tone. She simply looked up from her floor mop, stating naturally that the plants were actively dying in the darkness and that everything eventually perishes when denied access to light. The utter simplicity of her statement carried a profound emotional weight that struck Matthew like a physical blow, making him realize she was speaking about his own isolated existence. A few days later, while examining a complex medical text regarding spinal cord injuries, Matthew discovered a tiny, bright yellow sticky note tucked carefully between the dense pages. Written in Natalie's neat, rounded handwriting was a short sentence suggesting that true medicine was not merely a combination of chemical compounds, but also the presence of hope. Instantly infuriated by what he perceived as naive sentimentality, Matthew aggressively tore the yellow paper into tiny fragments and threw them into the trash bin beside his desk. Yet, despite his physical destruction of the note, the simple, powerful words remained firmly lodged within his mind, repeating like an inescapable echo through his sleepless nights. On the following Saturday afternoon, the faint sound of Natalie singing in the distant kitchen drifted through the cavernous hallways of the quiet mansion, catching Matthew completely off guard. Her voice was low, velvety, and slightly raspy from sheer physical exhaustion, carrying the melancholic but comforting melody of an old acoustic folk ballad about enduring love. Matthew closed his eyes, leaning his head back against his wheelchair, and allowed himself to simply listen to the music, without his usual analytical cynicism. Peter, his observant assistant, was the very first person to openly acknowledge the undeniable shift occurring within the walls of the Beacon Hill estate. While helping Matthew transition from his bed to his electric wheelchair one crisp morning, Peter casually remarked that the household felt significantly more peaceful lately. He added that Matthew appeared noticeably calmer and more settled since the new agency cleaner had begun managing the domestic responsibilities of the property. Matthew offered no verbal response to his assistant's observation, maintaining a stoic silence, but internally, he knew Peter's assessment was entirely accurate. He had begun structuring his entire week around the specific days Natalie was scheduled to arrive, paying close attention to the small details of her work. He noticed how she meticulously organized his morning financial newspapers chronologically, and how she always left the library window slightly cracked to invite fresh air into the room. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, he discovered her standing motionless before the massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelves in his private study. Entirely captivated by an old leather-bound classic, she apologized instantly, quickly returning the volume to its shelf, but Matthew interrupted her, asking if she had previously read that specific work during her studies. Natalie's eyes ignited with academic enthusiasm as she explained it was one of her favorite novels, detailing its profound narrative about a soul searching for meaning. She noted that while the character's relentless search ultimately destroyed him, the tragic beauty lay in the fact that he possessed the courage to try. Matthew stared at her intensely, asking in a quiet, vulnerable voice if she was also engaged in a perpetual search within her own difficult life. Natalie answered without a single shred of hesitation, stating she searched every single day for a valid reason to wake up at 5 o'clock. She explained that she sought meaning to endure hours of physical labor and late-night studying, finding it in small things like a perfect poem or a real conversation. She looked directly into his eyes as she spoke, and Matthew experienced a sudden, profound realization that he was the individual she was referring to. He quietly informed her that she was permitted to borrow any volume she wished from his collection, realizing that their brief conversations had become his lifeline. Matthew had never personally reviewed the granular financial ledgers or domestic staff payroll accounts of his household, as that meticulous task belonged entirely to Peter. However, on a rainy Monday morning, while waiting for a virtual conference with his corporate legal team, he accidentally opened a digital folder containing employee expenses. His eyes scanned the names until they locked onto Natalie Zeller's payroll profile, revealing a static monthly compensation of $3,000 for the past 6 months. Matthew's brow furrowed in immediate confusion, knowing that his estate operated under a strict policy dictating automatic salary increases every 3 months for exemplary staff. Natalie had been performing flawlessly for half a year, meaning her compensation should have naturally risen to at least $4,500 by now. He immediately summoned Peter to his private office, demanding to know why the dedicated cleaner had been severely underpaid due to an apparent administrative oversight. Peter looked visibly uncomfortable, explaining that he had actually attempted to process the scheduled salary increases for Natalie on 2 separate occasions during her tenure. However, Natalie had firmly and repeatedly rejected the additional money, explicitly stating she did not want anyone to think she was exploiting Matthew's condition. She insisted on earning an honest wage for honest work, claiming that the initial agreed-upon sum was entirely sufficient for her current living expenses. Matthew gripped the armrests of his wheelchair in absolute disbelief, stunned that someone facing severe financial hardship would reject money out of pure ethical principle. In the cutthroat corporate universe Matthew had inhabited for decades, individuals routinely sacrificed their morals for minor financial advancements, making Natalie's integrity seem completely alien. He ordered Peter to immediately retrieve her complete employment file, including her background check, original resume, personal references, and any investigative security reports. Half an hour later, Matthew sat alone under the green lamp of his desk, carefully reading through the comprehensive dossier compiled on Natalie Zeller. The standard security report, mandatory for all staff entering his estate, revealed that she had been tragically orphaned at age 17 when both parents died in a collision. She possessed absolutely no siblings or extended family, financing her entire life, and $45,000 of student debt through relentless, low-wage physical labor. The detailed report described her living conditions as a tiny, rented studio apartment in South Boston, noting clear signs of chronic physical fatigue and mild undernourishment. At the very bottom of the thick stack of papers, Matthew discovered a misplaced document that sent a cold shiver straight down his spine. It was a copy of his own confidential medical evaluation from 2 years prior, accidentally filed into Natalie's folder during a recent administrative reorganization. His eyes locked onto a section discussing an advanced, highly experimental stem cell regeneration therapy that carried a 40 to 60% chance of success. The medical report explicitly stated that the patient had completely refused to participate in the expensive procedure due to a total lack of motivation. Matthew stared at his own signature on the refusal waiver, remembering the dark, suffocating depression that had consumed his mind during that miserable period of his isolation. He realized that while Natalie was working herself to the bone to build a future, he had willingly discarded his own future out of sheer cowardice. At that exact moment, the office door opened softly, and Natalie stepped inside to begin her scheduled Tuesday cleaning routine, freezing when she saw his intense expression. She noticed the highly sensitive medical documents spread across the desk, her eyes widening as she recognized his name printed boldly across the top of the pages. She stepped closer, asking with genuine concern if he was experiencing an emergency, her voice breaking the heavy silence that gripped the private office. Matthew looked up at her, his voice tight with a mixture of suppressed emotion and authority, as he demanded to know why she hid her financial struggles. Natalie stood her ground, explaining calmly that accepting extra money from a vulnerable, paralyzed employer would feel like an act of emotional manipulation on her part. Matthew snapped bitterly, asserting that he was a powerful billionaire who could dissolve her employment with a single phone call, proving he was not vulnerable. Natalie did not flinch. Instead, she whispered that he would never do such a thing, because he kept her optimistic notes safely hidden inside his desk. Her profound insight left him utterly speechless, forcing him to realize that she understood his hidden heart far better than anyone else ever had. Dr. William Miller arrived at the Beacon Hill estate the following morning, carrying a leather briefcase filled with updated neurological data and experimental medical files. The seasoned physician sat opposite Matthew in the sunlit library, expressing his immense surprise at receiving a direct phone call after a full year of complete silence. Matthew did not engage in preliminary small talk. He immediately demanded a comprehensive breakdown of the experimental cellular regeneration therapy he had rejected 2 years prior. Dr. Miller adjusted his glasses, explaining that the complex procedure involved injecting highly specialized stem cells directly into the precisely damaged region of the spinal cord. He reiterated the 40 to 60% success rate, emphasizing that the treatment would require a brutal, exhausting year of intensive physical rehabilitation to show results. The doctor looked directly into Matthew's eyes, stating firmly that the physical medicine would mean absolutely nothing if his mind remained trapped in a state of total surrender. Matthew glanced out the grand window, watching Natalie walk down the snow-covered driveway with her heavy backpack of university textbooks, her resilient form radiating quiet strength. He turned back to the physician and declared with absolute certainty that his mindset had changed completely, and that he wished to begin the process immediately. The subsequent weeks evolved into a punishing gauntlet of agonizing diagnostic scans, painful muscle biopsies, and exhausting blood panels that tested Matthew's fading physical endurance. An exceptionally strict physical therapist named Evelyn began visiting the estate 3 times a week to aggressively prepare his atrophied lower limbs for the surgery. The initial rehabilitation sessions were deeply humiliating for Matthew, as he lay completely helpless on a treatment table, entirely unable to elicit a response from his legs. He found himself consumed by a dark, familiar wave of intense anger and fear, terrified that he was risking his fragile hope on a failure. Natalie noticed his profound discouragement during her Thursday shift, quietly setting her cleaning tools aside to sit on a chair right beside his treatment table. She shared a memory of her late mother, explaining that the most terrifying part of any difficult journey is simply summoning the courage to take the first step. Her gentle voice acted as a powerful anchor against his rising panic, providing him with the emotional strength necessary to endure Evelyn's grueling physical regimens. Sylvia Nelson, Matthew's executive assistant of 15 years, observed the unmistakable changes occurring within the Beacon Hill estate, with a toxic mixture of jealousy and alarm. She had meticulously managed Matthew's professional calendar and personal life for over a decade, harboring a deeply buried, unrequited love for her brilliant, emotionally distant employer. She viewed Natalie as a highly dangerous corporate and personal threat, an uneducated intruder who was rapidly dismantling the controlled world she had built. On a crisp Thursday afternoon, Sylvia arrived at the mansion early, intercepting Natalie in the grand foyer just as the young woman was concluding her shift. With a cold, calculated smile, Sylvia requested a moment of her time, leading her into a formal corporate conference room on the first floor. Sylvia leaned against the polished mahogany table, tossing a thick folder directly in front of Natalie and instructing her to review its highly sensitive contents. Natalie opened the file, her heart sinking as she recognized her own face on a comprehensive private security dossier detailing her parents' deaths and debts. Sylvia informed her coldly that Matthew had ordered a complete background investigation on her before she even crossed the threshold of the estate on her first day. She asserted that Matthew had never viewed her as a unique individual, but rather as a desperate, financially ruined girl who could be easily controlled. Natalie felt a profound wave of humiliation wash over her, realizing that her private struggles had been laid bare before her employer from the very start. Sylvia then produced a copy of a strict family corporate agreement Matthew had signed 5 years prior, pointing directly to a clause regarding personal relationships. The legal document explicitly stated that if Matthew ever entered a domestic partnership that threatened company assets, he would immediately forfeit his corporate voting power. Sylvia whispered cruelly that Matthew was merely using her as a temporary source of psychological amusement to survive his current medical crisis before discarding her. Broken-hearted and completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of Sylvia's calculated words, Natalie gathered her belongings and exited the conference room without shedding a single tear. She walked out into the freezing Boston winter, entirely convinced that her presence was actively endangering the massive legacy Matthew had sacrificed his life to build. Matthew sat near the library window for hours on Saturday morning, his anxiety escalating into a frantic panic when Natalie failed to arrive for her shift. He demanded that Peter immediately contact the domestic agency, only to learn that Natalie had abruptly requested an indefinite period of unpaid leave due to personal illness. For an entire week, the estate fell back into a state of oppressive, icy silence, with Matthew completely losing his focus during his physical therapy sessions. Evelyn stopped her treatment midway through a difficult session, bluntly telling Matthew that his physical body was completely shutting down because his spirit was absent. She demanded to know why a powerful, resourceful billionaire was sitting passively in a wheelchair instead of traveling downtown to find the woman he loved. Spurred into immediate action by Evelyn's fierce reprimand, Matthew ordered Peter to locate Natalie's exact residential address in South Boston and prepare the transport vehicle. An hour later, Matthew's luxury vehicle parked before a decaying brick tenement building, its narrow stairwells completely lacking any form of mechanical elevator access. Showing immense physical devotion, Peter carefully lifted Matthew out of the vehicle and carried him up 3 long flights of steep, humid stairs to apartment 23. Natalie opened the door, her eyes red from days of relentless crying, freezing in absolute shock as Peter placed Matthew onto a worn wooden chair. Left alone in the Spartan room, Matthew demanded to know why she had vanished from his life without a single word of explanation. Natalie tearfully confessed everything, detailing Sylvia's cruel intervention, her discovery of the background check, and her immense fear of destroying his multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. Matthew reached out, firmly grasping her trembling hands, and explaining that the background check was an automatic corporate security protocol he had never personally reviewed. He declared that he had retained her employment because her incredible, unbroken spirit had rescued him from a living death when he had surrendered completely. He shocked her by revealing that he had already instructed his legal team to completely dissolve the restrictive family agreement, gladly accepting a $1 million penalty. He stated with absolute conviction that he would willingly sacrifice 10% of his corporate shares to secure the freedom to love her forever. 1 month following their emotional confrontation in South Boston, Matthew lay prepared on a sterile operating table within Dr. Miller's private surgical pavilion. Natalie sat quietly in the sterile waiting room for 4 grueling hours, tightly clutching an old silver rosary that had belonged to her late mother. Dr. Miller finally emerged from the double doors, removing his surgical mask and informing her that the stem cell implantation had been executed flawlessly. However, he warned her that the upcoming recovery phase would involve a monumental amount of physical pain as the damaged nerve pathways began to regenerate. Throughout the subsequent 6 weeks of intense suffering, Natalie remained permanently at Matthew's bedside, sleeping on a small cot and managing his agonizing recovery. During an exceptionally intense rehabilitation session in the 6th week, Evelyn instructed Matthew to close his eyes and focus entirely on moving his right big toe. Matthew concentrated his entire universe into that single physical command, sending a desperate neurological signal down his spine while sweat poured down his pale forehead. Suddenly, the big toe of his right foot twitched visibly, a tiny movement of a few millimeters that caused Natalie to gasp in absolute disbelief. Matthew opened his eyes, a profound rush of tears spilling down his cheeks as he realized he could actually feel the solid surface of the floorboards. Dr. Miller arrived the following afternoon to conduct an array of neurological tests, declaring the rapid rate of nerve regeneration an absolute medical miracle. The seasoned doctor looked at the young couple, explaining that Matthew's severe depression had physically locked his nervous system far more than the structural accident. He noted that the presence of Natalie's unwavering love had effectively dismantled that psychological barrier, allowing his physical body to finally heal itself from within. 2 months after the delicate surgery, Matthew gripped the parallel steel rehabilitation bars, took a deep breath, and stood entirely upright on his own feet for 5 incredible seconds. Though his legs trembled violently from the monumental physical exertion, he looked directly into Natalie's radiant face and smiled a genuine, beautiful smile. He whispered that he had finally conquered the darkness, standing tall because she had given him a profound, beautiful reason to step forward into the light. 6 months later, the beautiful, golden autumn foliage of Boston swirled elegantly across the manicured lawns of the grand Beacon Hill estate. Matthew stood independently by the massive glass windows of his private executive office, walking with only a slight, resilient limp and completely free of any mechanical support. Natalie entered the room quietly, carrying 2 warm porcelain mugs of tea, her eyes shining happily behind a pair of stylish reading glasses. She had recently returned to a prestigious full-time university program, entirely financed by a new charitable foundation Matthew had established to support resilient students. Matthew wrapped his arms tenderly around her waist from behind, pressing a gentle kiss against her neck while looking at a flourishing green philodendron. The exotic houseplant, which had once withered silently in the dark corners of the mansion, was now thriving beautifully in the abundant sunlight of the windowsill. Matthew remarked softly that everything eventually perishes when denied access to light, repeating the profound lesson Natalie had introduced to his frozen world months ago. Natalie turned around within his warm embrace, resting her head against his chest, and reminding him that in the light, all living things possess the capacity to grow. As the evening sun dipped below the historic Boston skyline, painting the river in brilliant shades of crimson and gold, they stood together as equals. They were 2 resilient souls who had survived the deepest darkness of tragedy, emerges together into a magnificent, unwritten future, defined entirely by hope. The true measure of a human life is rarely found in the static numbers of a corporate balance sheet or the grand architecture of an isolated mansion, for the most profound architecture exists within the fragile spaces of the human heart. As the years advance and the physical strength of youth naturally yields to the quiet wisdom of maturity, we come to understand that the greatest paralysis we can ever experience is not a structural injury of the physical body, but rather the voluntary closing of the soul against the possibility of love. We build massive fortresses of bitterness and indifference to protect ourselves from the unpredictable storms of emotional vulnerability, entirely forgetting that the same walls keeping out the pain will inevitably block out the light that sustains our existence. It is an easy thing for an aging person to look back upon a life of material acquisition and realize that the moments of genuine connection, the quiet conversations shared in times of deep exhaustion, are the only treasures that retain their absolute value when everything else fades away. Second chances are rarely delivered to our doorsteps in the grand, dramatic fashion we anticipate. Instead, they arrive disguised as ordinary moments, embodied by individuals who possess the quiet courage to exist authentically in our presence, without demanding our perfection. We must maintain an open, receptive mind to recognize these quiet catalysts of transformation, understanding that a single individual, holding a worn book of poetry, can dismantle a lifetime of carefully cultivated despair if we simply grant them the space to breathe beside us. The true wisdom of the twilight years lies in the total surrender of our need for absolute control, recognizing that the beauty of our narrative is found in our willingness to take that terrifying first step into the unknown, even when our knees tremble with the memory of past fractures. Ultimately, we are all like those forgotten plants left to wither in the heavy shadows of our personal tragedies, waiting silently for a resilient hand to move us toward the window where the light can remind us how to grow once more.